I never thought I'd have to prove I was alive at 71. The morning I discovered my own obituary in the Asheville Citizen-Times, I was sitting in the rehabilitation center's garden, finally strong enough after my stroke to read the newspaper without my hands shaking. There it was, nestled between a retired banker and a beloved school principal. Elspeth Morven, 71, beloved mother, passed peacefully after a courageous battle with illness. My son Ambrose had written it himself. The flowery language didn't sound like him, but the lies certainly did. What would possess a grown man to tell the world his mother was dead when she was very much alive and getting stronger every day? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rehabilitation center in Wrightsville Beach had become my sanctuary for the past 6 months. After the stroke hit me last December while I was cataloging books in my home office, everything changed in an instant. One moment I was reaching for a leather-bound volume of Tennyson. The next I was waking up in a hospital bed with my left side refusing to cooperate, and my speech slurred like I'd been drinking cooking sherry. Dr. Linnea Harker had been frank with me from the beginning. Mrs. Morven, you're going to need intensive rehabilitation. The good news is that you're strong, and your mind is sharp as ever. The challenging news is that this will take time, and you'll need to be patient with yourself. Patient. I'd spent 43 years as head librarian at the Asheville Public Library System, and patience had never been my strongest virtue. I preferred action, organization, the satisfying click of due date stamps, and the whispered consultations that helped patrons find exactly what they needed. But lying in that sterile hospital room, listening to the rhythmic beeping of machines, I learned a new kind of patience. Ambrose had visited exactly twice during my initial hospital stay. The first time he'd stood at the foot of my bed, his expensive suit wrinkled from what I assumed was a hurried trip from Charlotte, where he worked as a corporate consultant. He'd looked uncomfortable, checking his phone more than he looked at me. "Mother, the doctors say you're going to be fine," he'd said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "I've arranged for you to go to an excellent rehabilitation facility. It's quiet, private. You'll have everything you need." I tried to speak, but the words came out garbled. The frustration of having so much to say, and no clear way to say it was perhaps worse than the physical limitations. Ambrose had interpreted my struggle as agreement. Good. I'll handle everything from here. You just focus on getting better." His second visit came 3 weeks later, just before I was transferred to Wrightsville Beach. This time he'd been more composed, more like the smooth-talking businessman I'd watched him become over the years. He'd brought paperwork. "I need you to sign some documents," he'd explained, spreading papers across the adjustable hospital table. "Power of attorney, so I can manage your affairs while you're recovering. It's just temporary, of course." My speech had improved slightly. By then, enough for me to ask, "What affairs?" "Your house, bills, that sort of thing. Don't worry about the details, Mother. I'll take care of everything." I should have read those papers more carefully. I should have asked more questions, but I was tired, overwhelmed by the sudden upheaval of my orderly life, and frankly grateful that someone was willing to handle the practical matters while I focused on relearning how to walk without stumbling, how to hold a coffee cup without spilling it down my front. The rehabilitation center had been a revelation. Tucked away behind sand dunes and live oaks, it felt more like a resort than a medical facility. My room overlooked the ocean, and I could hear the constant whisper of waves against the shore. The staff was kind but not patronizing, treating Me like an intelligent adult who happened to be temporarily impaired rather than a fragile invalid. My physical therapist, a young woman named Sarah, who had the patience of a saint and the determination of a drill sergeant, worked with me every morning. We started with basic movements, lifting my left arm, taking a few steps with a walker, and gradually progressed to longer walks along the beach, where the sand provided natural resistance training. "Mrs. Morven, you're making excellent progress," Dr. Harker told me during one of our monthly check-ins. "Your motor function has improved dramatically, and your speech is nearly back to normal. Have you given any thought to what you'd like to do when you're ready to go home?" Home. The word felt strange. I hadn't seen my house in months, hadn't spoken to any of my neighbors or former colleagues. Ambrose had assured me he was keeping an eye on things, but our phone conversations had grown increasingly brief and infrequent. "I suppose I'll need to see what condition the house is in," I'd replied. "And I'll want to check on my garden. The azaleas should be spectacular this time of year." Dr. Harker had made a note in my file. "Has your son mentioned anything about the property? Sometimes families make practical decisions during these situations." Something in her tone had made me pause. "What kind of practical decisions?" "Oh, you know, arranging for maintenance, perhaps selling if the upkeep becomes too much. Nothing unusual." But it had felt unusual, the way she'd said it. The careful neutralities of her expression suggested she knew something I didn't. It was Tom Granger who'd finally connected the dots for me. Tom had been my neighbor for 15 years, a widower about my age who'd taught music at the local high school until retirement. We'd developed a comfortable friendship over the years, sharing books and occasional dinners. Nothing romantic, but certainly meaningful. He'd started visiting me at the rehabilitation center about 2 months into my stay, making the drive from Asheville every other weekend. Tom was the one who'd brought me news from home, updates on our neighbors, and most importantly, the books I'd been craving. "Elsie, I have to ask you something," he'd said during one of his visits in late May. "We were sitting on the center's wraparound porch, watching pelicans dive for fish in the distance. I haven't seen any lights on in your house lately. When I asked Ambrose about it at the grocery store, he seemed odd about it." "Odd how?" "Evasive. Said you were doing well, but that it might be a long recovery. Then he mentioned something about the house being too much for you now." Tom had hesitated. "Elsie, has he discussed selling with you?" The question hit me like cold water. "Selling? Of course not. That house has been my home for 25 years. Why would I sell it?" Tom's expression had grown troubled. "I don't want to worry you unnecessarily, but there have been some changes in the neighborhood. New owners in the Patterson place, and I could have sworn I saw a realtor's sign in your front yard last month, but when I drove by the next day, it was gone." That conversation had planted a seed of unease that grew stronger with each passing day. I'd tried calling Ambrose several times, but he rarely answered, and when he did, his responses were vague and hurried. He was busy with work, he said. Everything was fine. I was imagining problems that didn't exist. But I hadn't been imagining the way my mail had stopped coming to the center. I'd asked the staff about it, and they'd confirmed that Ambrose had arranged to have everything forwarded to his address in Charlotte. "For simplicity," he'd told them. By early June, my recovery had progressed to the point where Dr. Harker was discussing discharge plans. I could walk unassisted, my speech was clear, and my cognitive function had returned to normal. I was ready to go home and reclaim my life. That's when I decided to surprise Tom with a visit. I hadn't told him I was coming, hadn't even told the rehabilitation center staff where I was going. I'd simply called a taxi and made the 3-hour drive to Asheville, eager to see my house and my garden and begin the next phase of my recovery. The house was empty, not just unoccupied, empty, completely, utterly empty. I'd stood in my living room, where my grandmother's piano used to sit, where my bookshelves had lined every wall, where my father's paintings had hung for decades. Nothing. The hardwood floors echoed with each step, and sunlight streamed through windows that had once been framed by the curtains I'd sewn myself. Tom had found me there 20 minutes later, sitting on the floor in the center of what used to be my living room, staring at the indentations in the hardwood where my furniture had stood. "Oh, Elsie," he'd whispered, and the sympathy in his voice had nearly broken me. That's when he'd shown me the newspaper clipping. The obituary was dated 3 weeks ago, 3 weeks during which I'd been walking on the beach, reading mystery novels, and planning my return to normal life, while the entire world believed I was dead and buried. Elspeth Morven, 7-1, beloved mother, passed peacefully after a courageous battle with illness. I read aloud in Tom's kitchen, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. She is survived by her loving son, Ambrose, and grandson, Elias. In lieu of flowers, the family. Request donations to the Asheville Public Library Foundation. Tom sat across from me, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug, watching my face with the careful attention of someone who'd taught teenagers for 30 years and knew how to recognize the moment before an explosion. "When did you first see this?" I asked. "About 2 weeks ago. Cressida Vaughan brought it to my attention." He grimaced slightly at the mention of our neighborhood's most dedicated gossip. "She was beside herself. Said she couldn't believe she'd missed the funeral. Asked me why I hadn't told her you were so ill." I set the newspaper down carefully, fighting the urge to tear it into confetti. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her there must be some mistake, that I'd been visiting you regularly, and you were very much alive." Tom leaned forward. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind, Elsie. Said maybe the grief was making me confused, that sometimes people see what they want to see. The casual cruelty of it struck me silent for a moment. Not just that my son had erased me from existence, but that he'd done it so thoroughly that even my friends doubted their own experiences when confronted with evidence of my death. "There's more," Tom said gently. "I went to the library yesterday. Asked if they'd received any memorial donations in your name." I waited, though I already knew what he was going to tell me. "Nearly $4,000, Elsie. People who remembered. You, former patrons, colleagues. They'd all seen the obituary and wanted to honor your memory. $4,000 donated in memory of a woman who was sitting in her neighbor's kitchen, very much alive and growing angrier by the minute. The Library Foundation would put that money to good use. But the principle of it, people mourning me while I was gardening and reading and learning to trust my left leg again, felt like a violation I couldn't quite name. "I need to see him," I said finally. "Ambrose. I need to understand what he was thinking. There has to be an explanation." Even as I said it, I knew how naive it sounded. You don't accidentally publish your mother's obituary. You don't accidentally sell her house and donate her belongings to charity, which is what Tom had discovered when he'd made some discreet inquiries around town. "Elsie," Tom said carefully, "maybe you should call him first, or have Dr. Harker contact him. This is, well, it's a lot to process. But I'd spent 6 months processing the stroke, the loss of independence, the slow rebuilding of my physical capabilities. I'd been patient with my body's betrayal, understanding with my temporary limitations, gracious about accepting help. I was done processing. "Do you know where he is?" I asked. Tom hesitated. "Actually, yes. Cressida mentioned that he's having a big birthday party this weekend. 40th birthday, apparently. At the Grove Park Inn." Of course he was. The Grove Park Inn. Asheville's most prestigious resort, where the wealthy came to see and be seen, where Ambrose could play the grieving son while celebrating his milestone birthday in style. "Saturday night," Tom continued. "Cressida said it's supposed to be quite the affair. 100 guests, live music, the works." I felt something shift inside me, a crystallization of purpose that reminded me of how I'd felt during my library career when faced with a particularly challenging research request. There was a problem to be solved, information to be gathered, and a truth to be uncovered. "What day is today?" I asked. "Thursday. 2 days. 2 days to prepare for what would undoubtedly be the most dramatic confrontation of my 71 years. "Tom," I said, standing up from his kitchen table with more confidence than I'd felt in months, "I'm going to need your help." "What kind of help?" "The kind that involves buying a dress suitable for crashing a party where I'm supposed to be dead." Tom's expression shifted from concern to something that might have been admiration. "Elsie Morven. You're going to give that boy the shock of his life. That's the idea." We spent the rest of Thursday afternoon doing reconnaissance. Tom drove while I sat in the passenger seat of his old Honda, feeling like a detective gathering evidence for a case I was determined to win. We went to the library first, where I had the surreal experience of seeing my own memorial plaque. "In memory of Elspeth Morven, 1953 to 2024, who opened worlds through words," read the brass plate mounted near the circulation desk where I'd worked. "For over 4 decades, Margaret Chen, who'd been my assistant director for the last 10 years, was behind the desk. When she looked up and saw me standing there, her face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical under different circumstances. Confusion, disbelief, and then something approaching terror. "Mrs. Morven?" she whispered. "But how—" "Hello, Margaret. I hear you've received some donations in my memory." She nodded mutely, still staring at me as if I might disappear if she blinked. "I'm not dead," I said conversationally. "Just thought you should know." We left Margaret to process that information and drove to what used to be my house. The new owners had painted it a cheerful yellow. I'd always preferred the classic white, and had planted annuals where my perennial garden used to flourish. A young woman was loading groceries from a minivan while 2 small children played. In the front yard. "Nice family," Tom observed. "I'm sure they are." I watched the children chase each other around the oak tree I'd planted when Ambrose was born. I just wish I'd been consulted about selling it to them. Our final stop was the most painful, the storage unit facility on the outskirts of town, where Tom had discovered that some of my belongings had ended up after what the facility manager cheerfully called an estate sale situation. Unit 47 contained the remnants of my life. Boxes of books, my grandmother's china, photo albums, and furniture that hadn't been deemed valuable enough for the estate sale. Someone, presumably Ambrose, had paid 6 months' rent in advance. I stood among the cardboard boxes and covered furniture, recognizing items I'd treasured for decades, now reduced to storage unit overflow. My father's watercolor paintings were stacked against one wall. The quilt my mother had made for my wedding was folded in a plastic bin. Books I'd collected over a lifetime were packed away like inventory. "This is what's left of me," I said to Tom, who was examining a box labeled "Kitchen Misc." "No, Elsie, this is just stuff. You're what's left of you." He was right, of course. But seeing my possessions reduced to storage unit contents felt like attending my own estate sale. Except I'd missed the actual event. That evening, back at Tom's house, I called Dr. Harker. "Mrs. Morven, how wonderful to hear from you. How are you feeling?" "Physically excellent. Emotionally, somewhat complicated." I explained the situation while she made appropriately shocked sounds. "This is highly irregular," she said when I'd finished, "and frankly, potentially illegal. You might want to consider consulting with an attorney." "I might. But first I have a party to attend." There was a pause. "Mrs. Morven, while I admire your initiative, perhaps a more private confrontation would be advisable. Family matters can be delicate. Dr. Harker." "My son told an entire community that I was dead. He sold my house, disposed of my belongings, and has been accepting condolences and memorial donations for 3 weeks. I think we're well beyond delicate." "When you put it that way," she sighed. "Just promise me you'll be careful. Stress can trigger setbacks, especially after a stroke. The only thing that's going to trigger a setback is if I don't address this situation head-on." After hanging up, I sat in Tom's living room, planning my resurrection. I thought about all the times over the years when I'd bitten my tongue instead, of speaking up when I'd prioritized keeping peace over standing up for myself. My marriage to Ambrose's father had been built on such compromises. My relationship with my son had continued the pattern. But sitting in that storage unit, seeing my life reduced to boxes and bins, something had shifted. Maybe it was the stroke. Maybe it was the months of rebuilding myself from the ground up. Or maybe it was simply the clarifying effect of discovering that your own child has written you out of existence. Whatever it was, I felt more like myself than I had in years. "Tom," I called to the kitchen, where he was washing our dinner dishes. "Tomorrow we're going shopping. I need to look like someone who's supposed to be dead, but refuses to stay that way. What kind of look is that, exactly?" I smiled for the first time since reading my own obituary. "Unforgettable. Shopping for an outfit to wear to your own resurrection is not something they prepare you for in finishing school. Not that I'd attended finishing school, but my mother had drilled enough propriety into me that I generally knew how to dress appropriately for any occasion. This particular occasion, however, was uncharted territory. Tom and I spent Friday morning at the Asheville Mall, where I discovered that shopping for formal wear as a 71-year-old woman who'd recently learned to walk without assistance was an adventure in itself. The young sales associate at Dillard's kept steering me toward what she clearly considered age-appropriate options: beige cardigans, sensible flats, and dresses that seemed designed to render their wearers invisible. "I need something with more presence," I told her after rejecting the third iteration of what I'd begun thinking of as the nice grandmother uniform. "Presence? Something that says, I'm very much alive and about to ruin someone's evening." She looked at Tom helplessly. He was no help, standing near the jewelry counter and trying not to laugh. "Maybe something in navy," she suggested weakly. I was beginning to understand why Ambrose had found it so easy to erase me. Somewhere along the way, I'd allowed myself to become the kind of woman people expected to fade quietly into the background, the kind of woman whose death might be considered a minor inconvenience rather than a devastating loss. Not anymore. "Show me your evening wear," I said firmly. "And I don't mean the section for women who've given up." An hour later, I emerged from the dressing room wearing a dress that would have made my mother faint and my former library colleagues clutch their pearls. It was deep emerald green, the color of my birthstone and my eyes, with a neckline that was sophisticated without being scandalous, and a fit that reminded me I'd once been considered quite attractive. "Mrs. Morven," Tom said, standing up straighter when he saw me. "You look alive. Magnificent." The sales associate had recovered her composure and was nodding approvingly. "This is much better, very elegant, and the color is perfect with your complexion." I studied myself in the three-way mirror, seeing not the recovering stroke patient or the abandoned mother, but Elspeth Morven, former head librarian, woman of substance, force to be reckoned with. The dress cost more than I'd spent on clothing in the past 5 years combined. But considering I'd apparently died penniless, while my son inherited whatever assets I'd had, I decided to treat it as an investment in my future. "I'll take it," I said. "And I'll need shoes." The shoes were another revelation. I'd been wearing sensible, comfortable footwear for so long that I'd forgotten the transformative power of a well-chosen heel. Not too high. I wasn't foolish enough to risk my newly restored balance on stilettos, but enough to change my posture, my stride, my entire presence. "You know," Tom said as we left the mall with our purchases, "you might want to call him first. Give him a chance to explain before you make this public." I'd been considering the same thing, but every time I imagined that conversation I could hear Ambrose's voice making excuses, spinning explanations, treating me like a confused old woman who'd misunderstood the situation. He was skilled at that, had been doing it for years in small ways that I'd ignored or rationalized. "Tom, do you remember when I had my 60th birthday?" "Of course. You had that lovely party at your house. Ambrose gave a speech about how proud he was of you." "Do you remember what he said exactly?" Tom was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Something about your dedication to the community. How you touched so many lives through your work at the library. He said I was a woman who'd found her purpose in service to others." I could still hear his voice, the particular inflection he'd used that had made it sound like a compliment while somehow diminishing me. He made it sound like I'd never had ambitions beyond being useful. That's not how I remember it. Because you weren't listening for the subtext, but I was. I've been listening to it for years. I stared out the car window at the familiar streets of Asheville, seeing them with new eyes. He's always been embarrassed by me, Tom. Not ashamed exactly, but embarrassed. I was too simple, too small town, too much of a reminder that he came from modest beginnings. Tom pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine. "Even if that's true, it doesn't explain why he'd tell people you were dead. Doesn't it? Think about it from his perspective. His mother has a stroke, needs long-term care, becomes a complication in his carefully curated life. He's building a consulting business, dating a woman from a prominent family, trying to establish himself in Charlotte's social scene. Having a mother in rehabilitation doesn't fit the image he's trying to project. So, he decided you were better off dead? He decided he was better off with me dead." The words felt strange to say, but they rang true. It's actually quite efficient, if you think about it. No messy medical decisions, no awkward explanations about why he's not visiting me. No need to integrate his simple mother into his sophisticated life. Tom was quiet for a long moment. "You know, when you put it that way, tomorrow night is going to be even more satisfying than I thought." We spent the afternoon planning my entrance. The Grove Park Inn was hosting Ambrose's party in the Great Hall, their most prestigious venue. Tom had managed to get the basic details from Cressida, who was attending as the guest of one of her society friends. Cocktails at 6, dinner at 7, dancing and speeches afterward. "The question is timing," I said, sitting at Tom's kitchen table with a notepad, feeling like a general planning a campaign. "Too early, and people might not have had enough to drink to make the evening properly memorable. Too late, and I risk missing the speeches." "What speeches?" "Oh, there will definitely be speeches. Ambrose loves being the center of attention, and this is his 40th birthday. He'll want to address his guests, probably talk about how much this past year has meant to him, how grateful he is for everyone's support during his difficult time." Tom raised an eyebrow. "His difficult time?" "Losing his mother, grieving, moving forward with courage and determination." I could practically write the speech myself, having heard variations of it throughout Ambrose's life, whenever he'd needed to reframe a situation, to his advantage. "So you want to arrive during the speeches?" "I want to arrive during his speech. I want to walk into that room when he's in the middle of talking about his dead mother and how much he misses her. That's diabolical. That's justice." As the afternoon wore on, I found myself thinking about Elias, my 17-year-old grandson. Ambrose's son was a quiet, thoughtful boy who'd always seemed more interested in books and music than in his father's business achievements. I'd tried to maintain a relationship with him over the years, but Ambrose had made it increasingly difficult, scheduling conflicts and creating obstacles that felt deliberate. How had Ambrose explained my death to Elias? Had he grieved? Had he wondered why he wasn't invited to the funeral? Had he asked questions that his father couldn't answer? "Tom, I need to call the rehabilitation center. I want to make sure they know where I am, in case anyone comes looking for me." "Who would come looking for you?" "I don't know, but I've been missing for 24 hours, and technically, I'm still a patient who checked herself out without being discharged. Dr. Harker was relieved to hear from me." "Mrs. Morven, I was beginning to worry. The staff said you'd left yesterday afternoon without informing anyone of your destination. I needed to come home and handle some family business." "I understand. How are you feeling? Any dizziness, fatigue, or confusion?" "My thinking has never been clearer." "Good. And your motor function?" "Excellent. In fact, I'll be attending a formal event tomorrow evening, so I'd say my recovery is complete." There was a pause. "Mrs. Morven, about that family business." "Yes?" "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I wanted you to know that I've made some notes in your file about the irregularities in your case. The lack of family involvement, the forwarded mail, the way certain decisions were made without your input. Thank you, Dr. Harker. I'm not saying anything legally questionable occurred, but if you decide to pursue this matter through official channels, there's documentation of the timeline." After hanging up, I sat quietly for a moment, processing the implications of what she'd said. I hadn't thought beyond tomorrow night's confrontation, hadn't considered what might come after I'd proven I was alive, and demanded answers. But Dr. Harker was right. There would be legal questions, financial complications, official inquiries. My house had been sold. My belongings had been disposed of. Medical decisions had been made in my name. Money had been accepted under false pretenses. The more I thought about it, the more complex the situation became. "Tom," I said slowly, "I think I'm going to need more than a dramatic entrance to sort this out." "What do you mean?" "I mean that tomorrow night is just the beginning. After I've ruined Ambrose's party and proven I'm not dead, I'm going to have to figure out how to rebuild a life that's been systematically dismantled." Tom sat down across from me, his expression growing serious. "Are you having second thoughts about tomorrow?" "No. If anything, I'm more determined than ever. I looked at him. This kind man who'd driven 3 hours every other weekend to visit me, who'd helped me discover the truth about my situation, who'd spent the day helping me shop for a resurrection dress. But I'm also realizing that I can't do this alone. You're not alone, Elsie. I know. And that might be the most important thing I've learned in all of this. I smiled at him, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the late afternoon sun streaming through his kitchen window. My son wrote me off as a friendless, forgettable old woman. But he was wrong, wasn't he? Completely wrong. That evening I called Cressida Vaughan. It was a calculated risk. Cressida was notorious for her inability to keep secrets. But that was exactly what I was counting on. Cressida, it's Elsie Morven. There was a long silence, followed by a sound that might have been choking. Elsie, but how... I mean, you're dead? Yes, I've heard that rumor. It's been greatly exaggerated. Oh my God, Elsie, what is happening? I saw your obituary. I went to the library and made a donation. I told everyone how sorry I was that I'd missed the funeral. There was no funeral, Cressida, because I'm not dead. Though I understand, my son has been accepting condolences. This is... I don't even know what this is. This is what happens when someone decides to write their inconvenient mother out of their life story. I paused, letting that sink in. Cressida, I understand you're attending Ambrose's birthday party tomorrow night. Well, yes, but under the circumstances, I'd like you to continue with your plans. In fact, I'm hoping you'll be there to witness something quite remarkable. Witness what? My resurrection. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp, October clarity that made Asheville look like a postcard. I woke up in Tom's guest room feeling more rested than I had in months, despite the magnitude of what I was planning to do that evening. There's something to be said for having a clear purpose, even when that purpose involves confronting your son about faking your death. Tom was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, and the smell of coffee and bacon suggested he'd been up for a while. Big day, he said, handing me a mug. The biggest. We'd agreed that I would spend the morning at the rehabilitation center, both to officially check myself out and to retrieve the personal items I'd left behind. The afternoon would be for final preparations, and then we'd drive to the Grove Park Inn in time for me to make my entrance during the evening's festivities. The drive back to Wrightsville Beach gave me time to think about the past 6 months, about who I'd been when I arrived there and who I was becoming. The woman who'd checked into that rehabilitation center had been broken in more ways than just physically. She'd been someone who apologized for taking up space, who minimized her own needs, who'd spent decades making herself smaller to accommodate other people's comfort. The woman who was checking out was someone I was still getting to know. Dr. Harker was waiting for me when I arrived, and her expression was a mixture of professional concern and barely concealed curiosity. Mrs. Morven, I have to ask, are you absolutely certain about your plans for this evening? More certain than I've been about anything in years. I understand you're angry, and you have every right to be. But public confrontations can be unpredictable. Have you considered a private meeting first? I thought about that question while we completed my discharge paperwork. Had I considered a private meeting? Of course I had. But every scenario I'd imagined ended the same way, with Ambrose offering explanations that weren't really explanations, apologies that weren't really apologies, and promises to fix everything that would leave him in control of the narrative. Dr. Harker, my son didn't just lie to me. He lied to an entire community. He accepted their sympathy, their donations, their support, all while knowing it was based on a complete fabrication. A private conversation allows him to spin this as a misunderstanding, a well-intentioned mistake that got out of hand. And a public confrontation. A public confrontation forces him to face the consequences of his choices in front of the people he deceived. She nodded slowly. I can see the logic in that. Just promise me you'll be careful with your stress levels. Major emotional events can trigger setbacks. I promise. But as I packed my few belongings from the rehabilitation center room that had been home for 6 months, I realized that I wasn't stressed about the evening ahead. I was energized in a way I hadn't felt since before my stroke, maybe since before my husband died 15 years ago. When I'd first started the slow process of shrinking myself to fit into the narrow space Ambrose thought a widowed mother should occupy. The drive back to Asheville was quiet. Both Tom and I lost in our own thoughts. I found myself remembering Ambrose as a child, trying to understand when our relationship had begun to shift from normal parent-child dynamics to something more calculating on his part. His father had died when Ambrose was 25, just starting his career, and I'd been so focused on helping him through his grief that I'd missed the signs of how he was beginning to view me. Not as a person with my own needs and desires, but as a responsibility to be managed, a problem to be solved, a complication to be minimized. The pattern had been subtle at first, suggestions about my social activities that gradually became expectations, opinions about my decisions that slowly morphed into requirements. By the time I recognized what was happening, I'd already trained myself to defer to his judgment about my own life. "Elsie," Tom said as we pulled into his driveway, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. What happens after tonight? I mean, assuming everything goes according to plan, and you successfully ruin your son's party. What then?" It was a question I'd been avoiding, partly because the answer was so overwhelming. "I suppose I'll have to figure out how to rebuild a life that's been completely dismantled." "That's not what I mean." He turned off the engine and looked at me, directly. "I mean, what do you want your life to look like? Not the practical details, but the big picture. What kind of life do you want to live?" Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I sat quietly for a moment, realizing that no one had asked me that question in years. Certainly not Ambrose, who'd been more interested in telling me what kind of life I should want. Not even myself, really. I'd been so focused on being the kind of mother and widow I thought I was supposed to be that I'd never considered what I might actually want. "I want to matter," I said finally. "Not just as someone's mother or someone's memory, but as myself. I want to wake up in the morning with purposes that are mine, not obligations that someone else has decided I should fulfill." "And where do you want to do that?" "I don't know yet. The house is gone, which is actually liberating in a way. I can go anywhere, be anyone." I smiled at him. "Did you know I always wanted to travel? Before I got married, I had this fantasy about taking a year to explore Europe, maybe teaching English somewhere exotic. I never did it because there was always something more practical that needed to be done. It's not too late." "No," I agreed, feeling a flutter of something that might have been excitement. "It's not too late." We spent the afternoon in comfortable preparation. I took a long bath, did my hair and makeup with more care than I'd taken in months, and slowly transformed myself into the woman who was going to walk into the Grove Park, in and reclaim her existence. The emerald dress fit perfectly. The heels added just enough height to make me feel powerful without making me feel unsteady. and when I looked in Tom's guest room mirror, I saw someone I recognized but hadn't seen in a long time. Someone formidable. Tom was waiting in the living room when I came downstairs, wearing a dark suit that made him look distinguished and slightly mysterious. I'd forgotten what an attractive man he was when he wasn't wearing his usual uniform of cardigan and khakis. "You look beautiful, Elsie." "I look like someone who's about to cause a scene." "Even better." The drive to the Grove Park Inn took 20 minutes, during which I mentally rehearsed what I was going to say. I'd considered several approaches. The dramatic entrance with a simple, "Hello, Ambrose," the pointed question about why he'd written my obituary, or the more theatrical, "Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated." But as we pulled into the resort's circular drive, watching well-dressed guests streaming toward the Great Hall, I realized that my words mattered less than my presence. The simple fact of being alive, being there, being impossible to ignore or explain away, that would be message enough. "Are you ready?" Tom asked, offering me his arm as we approached the entrance. I've been ready for this my entire life. I just didn't know it until now. The Great Hall was exactly as I'd imagined. Elegant, expensive, and filled with the kind of people Ambrose had spent his adult life trying to impress. I recognized some faces from Asheville's social scene, others from the business community where Ambrose had built his reputation. They were all dressed impeccably, holding crystal glasses and making the kind of conversation that sounded meaningful, but said nothing. I spotted Cressida near the bar, holding court with a group of women I recognized from various charity committees. When she saw me, her face went through the same series of expressions as Margaret at the library: confusion, disbelief, and then something approaching panic. But I wasn't ready for Cressida yet. I was looking for Ambrose. I found him near the far end of the hall, standing beneath an enormous chandelier with a woman I didn't recognize, but who clearly fit his type. Young, beautiful, expensively dressed, and hanging on his every word. This would be Marigold, the girlfriend Tom had mentioned. Ambrose looked exactly like what he was, a successful, confident man celebrating his 40th birthday, surrounded by people who admired him. He was telling some story that was making his audience laugh, gesturing with the easy charisma that had always been his greatest asset. He looked happy, more than happy. He looked liberated, like a man who'd finally freed himself from all his burdens and complications, like a man whose mother was conveniently dead. "There he is," Tom murmured beside me. "Yes." I watched my son for another moment, memorizing the expression on his face before I changed it forever. "Tom, I need you to do something for me. Anything. I need you to find someone with a phone who's willing to record what's about to happen. I want documentation of this moment." Documentation? For later, when he tries to claim this never happened, or that I'm confused, or that there's some reasonable explanation for all of this. I straightened my shoulders and checked my lipstick in the reflection of a nearby mirror. I want proof that Elspeth Morven walked into this room very much alive and demanded answers. Tom squeezed my hand once, then melted into the crowd to find our videographer. I stood alone for a moment, gathering my courage and my clarity, watching the man who'd erased me from existence enjoy the fruits of his deception. Then I began walking toward him, my heels clicking on the marble floor with a rhythm that sounded like determination. The first person to notice me was a young man standing near Ambrose's group, someone I didn't recognize, but who was staring at me with the kind of intensity that suggested familiarity. It took me a moment to realize why his face seemed familiar, and then it clicked. This was Elias, my grandson, but older than I remembered him, taller and more serious-looking than the 15-year-old I'd last seen 2 years ago. He was staring at me like he'd seen a ghost, which, I suppose, he had. Our eyes met across the crowded room, and I saw him say something to the person next to him, a girl about his age with short dark hair and knowing eyes. She followed his gaze, looked at me, then back at him with raised eyebrows. That's when I realized that Elias had never believed I was dead. The knowledge hit me like a physical blow. Here was this 17-year-old boy who'd apparently been living with the knowledge that his father had lied about my death, had probably been carrying that secret for weeks, maybe months. The guilt and confusion he must have felt. The impossible position Ambrose had put him in. I changed course slightly, moving toward Elias instead of directly toward Ambrose. My grandson deserved to hear from me before the evening exploded into chaos. "Elias," I said quietly when I reached him, laying a gentle hand on his arm. "Grandma Elsie." His voice was barely a whisper. I knew it. I knew you weren't dead. "How did you know?" "Because Dad couldn't answer any questions about it. When it happened, where you were buried, what you said at the end. Every time I asked, he got angry and told me I was being morbid." Elias looked toward his father, who was still holding court across the room, oblivious to our reunion. And because he seemed too happy about it, the girl next to him was listening, with wide eyes. "Elias," she hissed, "your grandmother is supposed to be dead. This is insane." "This is my friend Rebecca," Elias said. "Rebecca, this is my grandmother, who is apparently very much alive despite what my father has been telling." "Everyone!" Rebecca looked between us, processing the implications. "Your dad told people she was dead when she wasn't?" "That's the current theory," I said dryly. "That's so fucked up," Rebecca said, then immediately clapped a hand over her mouth. "Sorry, Morven. And don't apologize. That's an entirely appropriate response to the situation." Elias was studying my face with the kind of careful attention I remembered from his childhood. He'd always been an observant child, quiet but perceptive, the kind of boy who noticed things adults thought they were hiding. "Grandma Elsie, where have you been?" "Recovering from a stroke at a rehabilitation center on the coast. Your father knew exactly where I was." I glanced toward Ambrose, who was now looking around the room with the slightly restless expression of someone expecting something to happen. In fact, he arranged for me to be there. But why would he tell everyone you were dead? It was such a simple question, and I realized I didn't have a simple answer. How do you explain to a 17-year-old that his father had found his own mother so inconvenient that erasing her seemed like the logical solution? "I think," I said carefully, "that your father found it easier to grieve a dead mother than to care for a living one who needed help." Elias's expression hardened in a way that made him look older than his years. "That's the most horrible thing I've ever heard." "It is rather awful," I agreed. "But it's also given me some clarity about certain things." "What are you going to do?" I looked across the room at Ambrose, who was now checking his watch and saying something to Marigold that made her nod and start moving toward what appeared to be a small stage area where a microphone had been set up. "I'm going to let him give his speech," I said. "And then I'm going to have a conversation with him that's long overdue." "Can we watch?" Rebecca asked, then blushed. This is like the most dramatic thing that's ever happened in my entire life." "You can watch from a distance," I told her. "But Elias, I want you to stay close to me. Whatever happens next, you shouldn't have to face it alone. Grandma Elsie." Elias said quietly. I'm really glad you're not dead. So am I, sweetheart. So am I. Across the room, Ambrose was moving toward the microphone, and the crowd was beginning to shift and quiet in anticipation of his remarks. I could see Tom near the back of the room, standing next to a young woman who was discreetly holding up her phone. Ladies and gentlemen. Ambrose's voice carried clearly through the sound system, and the room fell silent. Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate this milestone birthday with me. He looked confident, comfortable, completely in his element. This was his audience, his moment, his carefully crafted life on full display. Turning 40 is one of those birthdays that makes you reflect on the journey that brought you here. He continued, and I could see several people nodding thoughtfully. It's been a year of significant changes for me. Some challenging, some ultimately liberating. Liberating. I felt Elias tense beside me. As many of you know, I lost my mother this past spring. Ambrose's voice took on the carefully modulated tone of someone sharing a personal grief. Elspeth Morven was a woman who dedicated her life to service, first as a librarian here in Asheville, and then as a mother who gave everything she had to help me become the man I am today. There was a murmur of sympathy from the crowd. I saw several people reach for their spouses' hands, touched by this glimpse into Ambrose's loss. Her death was sudden but peaceful, he continued, and while the grief has been profound, it's also taught me something important about legacy. We honor those we've lost, not by dwelling in sorrow, but by living the kind of life that would make them proud. I started walking toward the front of the room, moving slowly but deliberately through the crowd. A few people noticed me and stepped aside, probably assuming I was someone important who needed to be closer to hear the speech. My mother always believed that every ending was also a beginning, Ambrose said, his voice growing stronger. That, when one chapter of life closes, it creates space for new chapters to be written. I was halfway to the front now, close enough that Ambrose would be able to see me if he looked in my direction. But he was focused on his notes, on his carefully prepared remarks about the woman he'd supposedly lost. She would have been so proud to see all of you here tonight, celebrating not just my birthday, but the new chapter I'm beginning with the woman I love. He gestured toward Marigold, who beamed at him from the front row. In fact, I'd like to take this opportunity to share some exciting news with all of you. Oh no. I realized what was coming and quickened my pace. Marigold has agreed to be my wife. The room erupted in applause and congratulations. Marigold looked radiant, holding up her left hand to display what was clearly a very recent and very expensive engagement ring. Ambrose was grinning broadly, basking in the attention and approval. I reached the front of the room just as the applause was beginning to die down. That's wonderful news, Ambrose, I said, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. I'm so sorry I missed the proposal. But then, it's difficult to attend family events when you've been declared dead. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the chandelier crystals tinkling in the air conditioning breeze. Ambrose looked down at me from the small stage, and I watched his face go through a series of expressions that would have been amusing under different circumstances. Confusion, recognition, disbelief, and then something that looked like pure terror. "Hello, son," I said pleasantly. "Lovely party. I particularly enjoyed your speech about my tragic death and how liberating it's been for you." The crowd was beginning to murmur, people turning to their neighbors with questioning looks. I could hear fragments of conversation. "Isn't that his mother? But she's supposed to be. What is happening? Ambrose stood frozen at the microphone, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Marigold was staring at me with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for traffic accidents. Perhaps, I continued, projecting my voice so everyone in the room could hear, you'd like to explain to your guests why you published my obituary while I was very much alive and recovering from a stroke. That's when Marigold dropped her champagne, glass, and the sound of crystal shattering on marble seemed to break the spell that had fallen over the room. Suddenly, up everyone was talking at once, a buzz of shocked voices and urgent questions. But I only had eyes for my son, who was still standing at the microphone like a deer caught in headlights, finally facing the consequences of his elaborate deception. "Well, Ambrose," I asked, "what exactly do you have to say for yourself?" The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then Ambrose seemed to shake himself back to awareness, his politician's instincts kicking in, even as his world collapsed around him. "Mother?" he said into the microphone, his voice carefully controlled. "What? What are you doing here?" "Well, I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop by to see how you were handling my death." I smiled at him with the kind of sweetness that could cut glass. "Imagine my surprise to discover you'd gotten engaged. I'm a little hurt you didn't invite me to the proposal, but I suppose that would have been difficult since you've been telling people I'm dead." The crowd was no longer murmuring. They were buzzing with the kind of energy that comes when ordinary people find themselves witnessing something extraordinary. I could see phones coming out, people starting to record what was clearly going to be one of Asheville's most talked-about social events in recent memory. Ambrose stepped away from the microphone and down from the small stage, approaching me with the kind of forced calm that suggested he was still hoping to manage the situation. "Mother, you're clearly confused. You've been very ill, and I think the stress of being out in public might be affecting your judgment." It was exactly the response I'd expected. The gentle dismissal, and the suggestion that I was mentally impaired, the implication that this was all some sort of misunderstanding caused by my medical condition. I'd heard variations of it for years, whenever I'd questioned his decisions or expressed opinions he didn't like. "Confused?" I repeated loud enough for everyone to hear. "Ambrose, I have the newspaper clipping right here." I reached into my purse and pulled out the obituary. "Would you like me to read it to your guests? Elspeth Morven, 71, beloved mother, passed peacefully after a courageous battle with illness." Several people in the crowd gasped. I could see Cressida pushing her way toward the front, her face alight with the kind of excitement that comes from witnessing premium gossip unfold in real time. "I'm particularly fond of this part," I continued. "She is survived by her loving son, Ambrose. Very touching, don't you think? Although I have to say, the part about passing peacefully is a bit premature, since I'm standing right here, very much alive and increasingly less peaceful by the minute." Marigold had moved to Ambrose's side, her face pale but her jaw set with determination. "Mrs. Morven," she said, her voice carefully modulated, "perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private." "Oh, I don't think so," I replied. "This conversation has been private for too long, 6 months, to be exact, during which time my son has been accepting condolences and memorial donations while I was recovering from a stroke that he apparently decided was fatal." "Memorial donations," someone in the crowd called out. $4,000 to the Library Foundation last I heard," I said conversationally. "All from people who wanted to honor my memory. It's really quite touching, although I do wonder what the legal implications are of accepting charitable donations under false pretenses." I saw Ambrose flinch at that, and I realized he hadn't considered the potential legal ramifications of his deception. He'd been so focused on the social and emotional benefits of my convenient death that he'd overlooked the practical complications. "Now, see here," came a voice from the crowd, and I turned to see Judge William Patterson, a man I'd known professionally for years. "If what you're saying is true, this is a serious matter. Fraud, at minimum." "Hello, William," I said pleasantly. "Lovely to see you again. As you can observe, reports of my death were greatly exaggerated." Judge Patterson was staring at me with the kind of professional interest that suggested he was already thinking through the legal implications. "Mrs. Morven, are you saying that your son deliberately published a false obituary?" "I'm saying that my son published an obituary announcing my death while I was very much alive and recovering in a rehabilitation facility. He also sold my house, disposed of my belongings, and has been living his life as a grieving orphan for the past several months." The crowd was getting restless now, people moving closer to hear better, others pulling out phones to capture what was clearly going to be the social event of the season. I could see Tom near the back giving me an encouraging nod. Ambrose was looking around the room with growing desperation, clearly realizing that this situation was beyond his ability to control or spin. "Mother, please, you're making a scene." "I'm making a scene?" I laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound. "Ambrose, you declared me dead and threw yourself a 40th birthday party to celebrate your newfound freedom. If anyone's making a scene here, it's you." "That's not... You don't understand." "Then explain it to me. Explain it to all of us." I gestured to the crowd, which had grown as word spread through the resort that something dramatic was happening in the Great Hall. "Explain how you managed to convince yourself that publishing your living mother's obituary was acceptable behavior." Marigold stepped forward, her social training apparently kicking in. "Perhaps we should all take a step back and—" "Oh, you must be the fiancé," I said, turning to her with interest. "How long have you two been dating?" "About 8 months," Marigold replied warily. 8 months. So you started dating right around the time I had my stroke. How convenient." I studied her face, seeing the moment when she began to understand the timeline. "Tell me, dear, when did Ambrose first mention that his mother had died?" Marigold's eyes widened as the implications hit her. He said, when we first met, he told me he'd recently lost his mother." "Recently lost? That's interesting phrasing, isn't it? Because when you first met 8 months ago, I was very much alive. Hospitalized, but alive." I could see the pieces clicking into place for Marigold. The realization that her relationship had been built on a lie from the very beginning. Her face was getting paler by the minute. "So you see," I continued, addressing the crowd but keeping my eyes on Ambrose. "This wasn't a recent decision born out of grief or confusion. This was a calculated choice to erase me from his life, so he could pursue a new relationship without the inconvenience of an aging mother who might need care." "That's not true," Ambrose burst out, finally finding his voice. "You don't understand what you're talking about." "Then enlighten me," I said calmly. "Explain to all of us exactly what I don't understand." Ambrose looked around the room wildly, seeming to realize for the first time how many people were watching, how many phones were recording, how completely he'd lost control of the narrative he'd spent months constructing. "You were sick," he said finally, his voice rising with frustration. "You had a stroke. You needed long-term care, and I couldn't—" "You couldn't what?" "I couldn't deal with it." The words burst out of him like they'd been under pressure for months. I had my business to think about. My life, my future. I couldn't put everything on hold to take care of a sick old woman who might never get better. The crowd drew in a collective breath at his raw honesty. Even I was taken aback by his bluntness, though I supposed I should have been grateful for the clarity. "So you decided I was better off dead?" I said quietly. "I decided we were both better off if I didn't have to spend the next decade of my life managing your medical care and declining health." Marigold was staring at him in horror. "Ambrose, you can't mean that." "Can't I?" "Look around this room, Marigold. Look at the life we've built, the future we're planning. Would any of this have been possible if I'd been tied down with a sick, needy mother who required constant attention?" The brutal honesty of it was almost refreshing. No more pretense, no more careful explanations or manufactured grief. Just the raw truth of how he saw me. As an inconvenience to be eliminated. "Well," I said after a moment, "I suppose I should thank you for finally being honest. Mother, No." I held up a hand to stop him. "You've said quite enough. In fact, you've said everything I needed to hear." I turned to address the crowd, many of whom were still recording the exchange. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for disrupting your evening, but I wanted you all to witness this moment. I wanted there to be no doubt about what happened here, no possibility for my son to later claim this was all a misunderstanding or the product of an old woman's confusion." I pulled out my phone and showed them a photo Tom had taken of me standing in my empty house. "This is what I found when I went home yesterday. My house sold, my belongings disposed of, my life erased." I looked directly at Ambrose. All while, I was getting stronger every day, looking forward to coming home and resuming my life. Judge Patterson stepped forward. "Mrs. Morven, I think you should consider filing formal charges. What's been done here is unconscionable." "Perhaps I will, William. But first, I want to give my son one more chance to do the right thing." I turned back to Ambrose, who was standing there looking like a man who'd just watched his entire world collapse in real time. "You have 24 hours, I said clearly. 24 hours to contact everyone you told about my death and inform them that you made a mistake. 24 hours to arrange for the return of any memorial donations that were made in my name. 24 hours to publicly acknowledge that you lied about my death for your own convenience. And if you don't, then I'll let Judge Patterson and anyone else who's interested pursue whatever legal remedies they think are appropriate." I smiled at him, and it was not a kind expression. I imagine there are quite a few laws about fraud, elder abuse, and theft that might apply to this situation. The room was dead silent now, everyone waiting to see how Ambrose would respond. But I wasn't waiting for his answer. I'd said what I came to say, done what I came to do. "Oh, and Ambrose," I added, turning back one last time. "Happy birthday." The immediate aftermath of my ultimatum was chaos in the most refined possible way. This was, after all, a gathering of Asheville's social elite, people who prided themselves on maintaining composure even in the most extraordinary circumstances. But underneath the veneer of polite murmuring and carefully modulated voices, I could feel the explosive energy of scandal rippling through the room. Ambrose stood frozen where I'd left him, his face cycling through emotions like a broken kaleidoscope. Marigold had taken several steps away from him, her engagement ring catching the light as she twisted it nervously around her finger. The birthday celebration had transformed into something else entirely. A trial, a reckoning, a moment of truth that none of us would forget. "Grandma Elsie," Elias appeared at my side, his young face serious but relieved. "Are you okay?" "I'm better than okay, sweetheart. I'm finally telling the truth. Rebecca was with him, her eyes wide with the kind of excitement that comes from witnessing history being made. Mrs. Morven, that was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. You just completely destroyed him." "I didn't destroy him," I corrected gently. "I simply forced him to destroy himself with his own words. And that's exactly what had happened. By responding to my accusations with brutal honesty instead of denial or explanation, Ambrose had confirmed everything I'd said and added details I hadn't even known. The crowd had heard him admit that he'd found me inconvenient, that he'd prioritized his social life over my welfare, that he'd considered our entire relationship through the lens of what was best for him. Tom appeared beside me, his face flushed, with what looked like pride. "Elsie, that was magnificent. Absolutely magnificent. Did your friend get it all on video?" "Every word. Multiple angles, actually. Half the room was recording by the end." I nodded, satisfied. Whatever happened, next, there would be no way for Ambrose to claim this had been a misunderstanding or rewrite the narrative to make himself the victim. Cressida Vaughn was pushing through the crowd toward us, her face bright with the kind of excitement that comes from being present for the social event of the decade. "Elsie Morven, you are absolutely wicked, and I mean that in the best possible way." "Hello, Cressida." I cannot believe what I just witnessed. I mean, I literally cannot believe it. This is going to be talked about for years. She grabbed my arm with the familiarity of someone who just witnessed me achieve legendary status. "You need to tell me everything. Where have you been? How did you find out? When did you start planning this?" Before I could answer, Judge Patterson approached with the measured gait of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Mrs. Morven, I meant what I said about pursuing legal action. What your son has done is not just morally reprehensible, it's potentially criminal. I appreciate that, William, but I want to give him a chance to make this right before we involve the courts. 24 hours may not be enough time to undo the damage he's caused. Perhaps not. But it's enough time for him to decide what kind of man he wants to be going forward. As we talked, I became aware that Ambrose was moving toward us. His face set with the kind of grim determination that suggested he'd made some sort of decision. Marigold was not with him. I could see her near the exit, speaking urgently into her phone, probably calling her parents or a lawyer or someone who might help her extract herself from the disaster her life had just become. "Mother," Ambrose said when he reached us, his voice carefully controlled. "I need to speak with you privately." "I don't think so," I replied. "We've had quite enough private conversations. From now on, everything we discuss should be witnessed. This is a family matter. This stopped being a private family matter when you published my obituary in the newspaper and accepted memorial donations from my friends." Judge Patterson stepped forward slightly. "Son, if I were you, I'd be very careful about what I said. Next, there are several dozen witnesses here, many of them recording your every word." Ambrose looked around the room, seeming to notice for the first time how many phones were pointed in his direction. In the age of social media, his public humiliation was going to be preserved and shared beyond anything he could control. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally, and for the first time he sounded like the little boy I'd raised instead of the calculating man he'd become. "I want you to tell the truth," I said simply. "I want you to acknowledge what you've done and take responsibility for the consequences. And then what? You'll forgive me? We'll go back to the way things were." The question hung in the air between us, and I realized that this was the moment everything had been building toward. Not just the dramatic confrontation or the public humiliation, but the fundamental question of what our relationship would look like going forward. No, Ambrose. We can't go back to the way things were because the way things were allowed this to happen. I looked at him. This man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, and felt something shift inside me. Not hatred, not even anger anymore, but a kind of sad clarity. You're 40 years old, and you just told a room full of people that caring for your sick mother was too inconvenient for the life you wanted to live. That's not something we can just move past. So what are you saying? I'm saying that after tonight we're going to have the relationship you've already chosen for us. Distant, minimal, and entirely on your terms. The only difference is that now everyone knows why. Elias moved closer to me, and I could see the conflict in his young face. This was his father and his grandmother, and no 17-year-old should have to choose sides in a situation like this. Elias, I said gently, none of this changes how I feel about you. You're always welcome in my life, whatever I decide to do next. Grandma Elsie, where are you going to live? Your house is gone. It was a practical question that cut to the heart of everything. Where was I going to live? How was I going to rebuild a life that had been systematically dismantled? What did the future look like for a 71-year-old woman who'd just been publicly resurrected? I don't know yet, I admitted. But for the first time in years, I get to decide for myself. Dr. Harker appeared beside us. I hadn't seen her arrive, but news of the evening's events had apparently traveled beyond the resort. Mrs. Morven, I heard what happened. How are you feeling? Physically or emotionally? Both. Physically, I feel stronger than I have in months. Emotionally. I paused, taking inventory of the complex mix of feelings swirling through me. Emotionally, I feel free. That's a good sign. Major stress events can sometimes trigger setbacks, but you seem to be handling this remarkably well. I think, I said slowly, I'm handling it well because I'm finally telling the truth instead of pretending everything is fine when it isn't. Ambrose was still standing nearby, looking lost and uncertain. The confident man who'd been giving speeches about his liberation had been replaced by someone who seemed to be realizing for the first time what he'd actually lost. Mother, he said quietly, I never meant for it to go this far. What did you think would happen? Did you think I'd stay in rehabilitation forever? Did you think I'd die of shame when I discovered what you'd done? I thought you'd understand, that you'd see I was trying to protect both of us from a difficult situation. Protect us? Ambrose, you sold my house. You gave away my belongings. You erased me from existence. I shook my head, genuinely baffled by his logic. How exactly was any of that protecting me? Because now you don't have to go back to that life. You don't have to be the lonely widow living alone in a house that's too big for her, pretending she's fine when everyone can see she's struggling. The words hit me like a slap, partly because there was just enough truth in them to sting. I had been lonely sometimes. The house had felt too big after my husband died. There had been moments when I'd wondered if I was just going through the motions of a life rather than actually living one. But that didn't give him the right to make those decisions for me. Even if that were true, I said carefully, it was my life to struggle with, my house to feel lost in, my loneliness to work through. I looked at him directly. You don't get to erase someone just because you think they'd be better off erased. I was trying to help. No, you were trying to help yourself. If you'd wanted to help me, You would have visited more than twice during my recovery. You would have asked what I needed instead of deciding what would be most convenient for you. The crowd around us had grown as news of the confrontation spread through the resort. I could see hotel staff hovering uncertainly at the edges of the room, probably wondering whether they should intervene or just let the drama play out. "Mrs. Morven," came a voice from behind me, and I turned to see a young woman with a press badge and a recording device. "I'm Sarah Chen from the Asheville Citizen-Times. Would you be willing to make a statement about what happened here tonight?" Of course. The media had arrived. The same newspaper that had published my obituary was now here to cover my resurrection. "I'd be happy to make a statement," I said. "But first, I think my son has something he'd like to say." All eyes turned to Ambrose, who looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, trying to decide whether to jump or be pushed. He began, then stopped. "I don't know what to say." "Try the truth," I suggested. "It's liberating." He looked around the room at the faces of people who'd been his friends and colleagues and social connections, all of them waiting to see what he would do next. "I made a mistake," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Louder," I said. "And be more specific." "I made a mistake," he repeated, his voice stronger. "I told people my mother was dead when she wasn't. I was overwhelmed by her medical situation, and I took the coward's way out. It wasn't a complete confession, and it certainly wasn't an apology, but it was a start. More importantly, it was on record, witnessed by dozens of people, and captured on multiple devices." "Thank you," I said. "That's the first honest thing you've said to me in months." Sarah Chen stepped forward with her recorder. "Mrs. Morven, can you tell us where you've been for the past 6 months?" And suddenly, I realized that this moment, standing in this room, surrounded by witnesses, speaking truth to power, was going to define not just how this evening ended, but how the rest of my life began. "I've been recovering," I said, looking directly at the reporter but speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "Recovering from a stroke, yes, but also recovering my voice, my strength, and my sense of who I am when I'm not trying to be who someone else thinks I should be." 3 months later, I was sitting in a cafe in Savannah, Georgia, reading the morning newspaper and planning my day. The cafe was one of those charming establishments that seemed to exist outside of time, with mismatched furniture, local art on the walls, and the kind of coffee that made you want to linger for hours with a good book. I'd discovered Savannah quite by accident, during what I'd started calling my rediscovery tour, a meandering journey through the South that had taken me from the mountains of North Carolina to the coast of Georgia, staying wherever caught my fancy for as long as it felt right. The newspaper article about my resurrection, as the media had taken to calling it, had made national news for about a week. The story had everything journalists loved: family drama, social scandal, and a plucky older woman refusing to be written off. I'd given exactly 3 interviews, one to Sarah Chen at the Asheville Citizen-Times, one to a regional magazine, and one to a national morning show that had been persistent enough to track me down. After that, I'd politely declined all media requests and focused on the more practical matter of rebuilding my life. The legal situation had resolved itself more quickly than Judge Patterson had predicted. Faced with the possibility of fraud charges and the complete collapse of his social and professional reputation, Ambrose had moved swiftly to make restitution. The memorial donations had been returned, accompanied by personal apologies that he'd written himself. The sale of my house had been more complicated. The new owners had purchased it in good faith, But Ambrose had compensated me for its full market value, plus the cost of replacing my belongings. More importantly, he'd issued a public statement acknowledging his deception and apologizing to everyone who'd been affected by it. It hadn't been eloquent or particularly heartfelt, but it had been honest, and that was enough. Marigold had returned her engagement ring 3 days after the party. According to Cressida, who'd become my primary source of Asheville gossip through regular phone calls, she'd moved back to Charleston and was reassessing her priorities. I felt sorry for her. She'd been caught up in Ambrose's deception without understanding its full scope, and her social circle had been nearly as shocked by the revelation as mine had been. As for Ambrose himself, he'd left Asheville entirely. Tom had heard he'd taken a position with a consulting firm in Atlanta, far enough away to start fresh, but close enough to see Elias regularly. We hadn't spoken since that night at the Grove Park Inn, and I wasn't sure we ever would again. Some wounds run too deep for simple apologies to heal. But Elias and I had developed a wonderful correspondence. He wrote me letters, actual handwritten letters, every week, telling me about school and his friends and his plans for college. He was thinking about studying journalism, inspired partly by watching the media coverage of our family drama, and partly by what he called my commitment to truth-telling. Tom had visited me twice during my travels, once in Charleston and once here in Savannah. Our friendship had deepened into something warmer, though we were both taking our time exploring what that might mean. At our age, there was no rush, just the pleasant anticipation of discovering what was possible. "Excuse me, are you Elspeth Morven?" I looked up from my newspaper to see a woman about my age standing beside my table, holding a cup of coffee, and wearing the kind of uncertain expression that suggested she recognized me, but wasn't sure if she should acknowledge it. "I am," I said, setting down my reading glasses. "And you are?" "Dorothy Whitman. I read about what happened to you, and I just wanted to say—" She paused, searching for the right words. "I wanted to say that what you did was brave. Standing up for yourself like that. Thank you. Would you like to sit down?" She settled into the chair across from me, clearly relieved that I wasn't annoyed by the interruption. "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but your story gave me courage to have a difficult conversation with my own family." "Oh?" "My daughter has been trying to get me to move into assisted living. She means well, but I'm not ready, and I finally told her so." Dorothy smiled. I told her I wasn't going to let anyone else decide when my independence was over. This had been happening more frequently as I traveled. Women, mostly, approaching me to share their own stories of family members who'd tried to make decisions for them, of being overlooked or dismissed or treated like burdens. The response to my story had been so strong that I'd started wondering if there was something larger I could do with the experience. "Good for you," I said. "How did she take it?" "Better than I expected. I think she was so relieved that I was still capable of having opinions that she backed down pretty quickly. We talked for another 20 minutes, sharing stories and perspectives, with the easy intimacy that sometimes develops between strangers who recognize something in each other. When Dorothy left, she pressed a piece of paper into my hand with her. "Contact information. In case you ever want to continue this conversation," she said. "I have a feeling you're going to do something important with all this attention you've been getting." After she left, I sat thinking about her words while I finished my coffee. Something important. I'd been getting similar suggestions from people I'd met during my travels, from journalists who'd interviewed me, even from Dr. Harker, who'd called to check on my progress and mentioned that she'd been fielding inquiries from other medical professionals about elder advocacy. The truth was, I had been thinking about doing something more systematic with my experience. Not another book. There were already enough memoirs about family dysfunction. But something more practical. Maybe a non-profit organization focused on elder advocacy, or a consulting service for families dealing with difficult medical decisions, or even just a speaking series about the importance of listening to older adults instead of making assumptions about what they need. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Elias's number. "Grandma Elsie," his voice was bright with pleasure when he answered. "How's Savannah?" "Beautiful. I'm thinking about staying a bit longer than planned." I looked around the cafe, imagining myself as a regular here, getting to know the staff and the other customers, maybe finding a small apartment within walking distance. "How's school?" "Good. I got accepted to the summer journalism program at UNC. That's wonderful. I'm so proud of you. Thanks. And Grandma Elsie, I have some news." Something in his tone made me sit up straighter. "What kind of news?" "Dad called me last night. He wanted me to tell you that he's been in counseling." I was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "How do you feel about that?" "Confused, mostly. I mean, I'm glad he's getting help, but I'm also still pretty angry about what he did to you." "That's understandable. You can be both glad and angry at the same time." He asked if I thought you might be willing to talk to him eventually. I told him I didn't know, that it wasn't up to me. I looked out the cafe window at the Spanish moss draped over the trees, at the tourists strolling past with their cameras, and guidebooks, at the life I was building for myself one day at a time. "What do you think?" I asked Elias. "Do you think I should talk to him?" "I think you should do whatever feels right to you. But Grandma Elsie? Yes? I don't think you should feel like you have to forgive him just because he's sorry now. Some things are too big for sorry to fix." The wisdom in his 17-year-old voice made me smile. "When did you get so smart?" "I learned from the best." After we hung up, I sat for a while longer thinking about forgiveness and second chances, and the difference between healing and reconciliation. I wasn't ready to talk to Ambrose yet. Might never be ready. And that was okay. Forgiveness wasn't something I owed him just because he'd finally acknowledged the harm he'd caused. But I was ready for other things, ready to stop traveling and put down roots somewhere new. Ready to turn my experience into something that might help other people in similar situations. Ready to build a life that was entirely my own, without reference to anyone else's expectations or comfort level. I opened my laptop and started typing an email to Dorothy Whitman, the woman I'd met that morning. Then I opened a new document and began outlining an idea that had been percolating for weeks. A foundation focused on elder advocacy, with a particular emphasis on helping families navigate medical crises without losing sight of the patient's autonomy and dignity. As I wrote, I thought about the storage unit back in Asheville, where my possessions were still waiting for me to decide what to do with them. I'd kept paying the rent while I traveled, unable to make decisions about my father's paintings or my mother's quilt or the thousands of books I'd collected over a lifetime. But sitting in that Savannah cafe, planning my future, I realized I didn't need most of those things anymore. They belonged to the woman I'd been before the stroke, before the betrayal, before I'd learned that I was stronger and more resilient than I'd ever imagined. The woman I was becoming would choose her possessions as deliberately as she chose everything else, not because they represented the past, but because they supported the future she was creating. I pulled out my phone again and called Tom. "Elsie, how's Georgia treating you?" "Very well. Tom, I have a favor to ask. Anything." I want you to go through the storage unit and choose whatever you think I should keep. Books, definitely, and anything that has sentimental value. But everything else, the furniture, the household items, all the things I accumulated because I thought I needed them, I want you to donate them. Are you sure? Some of those pieces are quite valuable. I'm sure. I want to start fresh, and that means not dragging the weight of my old life into my new one. There was a pause. Does this mean you're not coming back to Asheville? Not to live, no. I'll visit, of course. But my life is somewhere else now. Where? I looked around the cafe again, at the afternoon light filtering through the windows, at the sense of possibility that seemed to permeate the air itself. Here, I think. At least for now. We talked for a few more minutes, making plans for him to handle the storage unit and ship me the items I wanted to keep. When we hung up, I felt lighter, as if I'd set down a burden I hadn't realized I was carrying. The cafe was beginning to fill with the dinner crowd, and I gathered my things to leave. Tomorrow I would start looking for an apartment, something small and bright with space for my books and maybe a piano. I would research the requirements for starting a nonprofit in Georgia. I would write letters to potential funders and collaborators, drawing on the network of contacts I'd built during my years as a librarian. But tonight I would simply walk through the historic district, marveling at the architecture and the gardens, at the sense of living in a place where the past and present existed in harmony. I would have dinner at a restaurant I'd never tried, read a book I'd been saving for the right moment, and fall asleep in my hotel room, planning the life I wanted to live. 3 months ago, I'd been a woman who discovered her own obituary in the morning newspaper. Tonight I was a woman writing her own story, one choice at a time. And tomorrow, when I woke up in Savannah, I would still be alive in every sense of the word. It wasn't the applause or the gasps, or even the way Ambrose's face had drained, of color that stayed with Elspeth Morven in the weeks after the Grove Park Inn spectacle. It was the silence, the sharp, unexpected hush that fell over the room after she spoke those fateful words. I'm so sorry I missed the proposal. But then, it's difficult to attend family events when you've been declared dead. In that silence, Elspeth had felt something she hadn't felt in years: agency. For the first time since her stroke, since her husband's death, since her son had slowly but thoroughly rewritten the terms of their relationship, she was no longer someone being managed or mourned or dismissed. She was alive, not just biologically, not merely ambulatory or medically recovered, but undeniably, unignorably present. In the days following the event, Asheville buzzed. What had happened at Ambrose Morven's birthday party rippled out beyond the resorts, stone walls. Newspapers picked up the story. Regional news anchors debated the ethical, legal, and psychological angles. And former colleagues from the Asheville Public Library system rallied behind their once-beloved director. But Elspeth didn't bask in it. She withdrew, not out of shame or regret, but out of necessity, because survival had been the first step. Reclamation was the next. She moved into a short-term rental near downtown, a modest Victorian home restored by a local couple who were thrilled to have her as a tenant. She resumed her twice-weekly beach walks, this time in Asheville's urban greenways, where birdsong replaced waves, but the rhythm of her stride reminded her of the ocean. Tom helped her settle in and continued to be a steady companion, his loyalty deeper than friendship, though she still hesitated to name it anything else. Some things, she'd learned, blossomed best in silence. Elias visited weekly. Theirs became a partnership of curiosity. He wanted to know everything, about her past, about his father's childhood, about the history hidden in the corners of Asheville's old homes and library stacks. In turn, Elspeth fed his growing love of storytelling, offering him thick envelopes of letters, clippings, and old photos. They sat together one afternoon on the porch, sipping hibiscus tea. "Do you think people can really change?" he asked, watching ants navigate the cracks in the floorboards. "I think most people don't," she answered. "But that doesn't mean they can't." "And Dad?" Elspeth tilted her head, considering. "He's trying to change the ending without rewriting the middle. That never works." Elias nodded, not pressing the matter. But later, as he hugged her goodbye, he whispered, "I'm really proud of you, Grandma. Not just for surviving, but for doing it loudly." The next day, she started drafting what would become a series of essays on age, autonomy, and the betrayal of invisibility. Her working title, Resurrecting Myself, Notes from the Other Side of the Obituary. 6 months later, spring had returned to Asheville. Azaleas flared along sidewalks, redbuds exploded in unexpected corners, and on a hillside overlooking the French, Broad River, a small crowd gathered around a new bronze plaque near a white pergola shaded by dogwood trees. It read, "The Elspeth Morven Garden for Living Voices, dedicated to those who refuse to be silenced. We bloom where we are no longer buried." The dedication ceremony, organized by the Asheville Public Library Foundation, was equal parts redemption and resistance. What had begun as a modest idea, returning the erroneously donated memorial, funds, had turned into a community project, led by patrons who believed in honoring the living, not just the dead. Elspeth was there, of course. She stood in the center of it all, wearing a cobalt blue dress, silver hair pinned into soft waves, and her cane hooked loosely over one arm like an accessory, rather than a necessity. She didn't speak formally. She'd done enough public speaking, for a lifetime, but her presence anchored the event. Later, as the crowd dispersed, Tom found her kneeling beside a patch of newly planted lavender, her fingers lightly brushing the soft purple blooms. "You did it," he said. "I didn't do anything," she murmured. "They did. The people who believed me. The ones who wouldn't let me disappear." "But you showed them how not to disappear." She stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "I suppose that's something." It was more than something. By now, Elspeth's essays had gained traction. One was republished in The Atlantic, another in AARP magazine. She'd been invited to speak at elder care conferences, had consulted with legislators on proposed protections for aging adults, and was working with a local nonprofit to pilot a storytelling initiative called Second Chapters, where seniors recorded and preserved their own narratives before anyone else could. Ambrose never reached out again. The silence this time was mutual. She didn't need closure. She had clarity. As for Elias, he graduated valedictorian and earned a full scholarship to UNC Chapel Hill's journalism program. In his application essay, he wrote, "The first time I saw my grandmother after believing she was dead, I didn't ask for proof. I didn't need it. Truth, when spoken clearly, doesn't require explanation. She taught me that. And one day, I'll pass that lesson on, not through facts, but through stories." That summer, Elspeth packed a single suitcase and boarded a train bound for Portland. She had speaking engagements scheduled in Seattle, a writer's residency waiting in Oregon, and a growing list of cities where people wanted to hear her voice. But as the train curved around the mountains, she didn't think of destinations. She thought of momentum, of reclamation, of lavender and typewriters and midnight letters from Elias, of Tom's quiet strength, of the quiet thrill of beginning again, not because she had to, but because she could. And as the engine thundered forward, she smiled, Alive at last, the train rolled into Portland beneath a sky of gray, watercolor clouds. The air had a sweetness to it, cool, wet, fresh. Elspeth stepped off the platform with the deliberate grace of someone who had nothing left to rush for and everything left to see. Her first stop was the small artist's residency she'd accepted on a whim, a 1920s craftsman house converted into a space for women over 60 to write, paint, and compose without apology or interruption. It was called the Quiet House, though it was anything but. Mornings were filled with the sound of tapping typewriters and slow jazz. Afternoons hummed with voices sharing drafts over tea. At night there were readings, some tentative, some raucous, under lanterns strung between rose bushes. Elspeth read aloud for the first time one chilly Friday night. She wore her navy cardigan, the one Tom had once said made her look formidable in the best way, and read her newest piece titled, "The Prettiest Lies Are Written in Obituaries." The room was silent when she finished. Not stunned silence, reverent silence. Then came applause, not pitying, not polite, but full-hearted and proud. Later, a woman named Renata approached her, late 70s, cane in hand, with the gait of a ballerina and the tongue of a war poet. "You didn't just survive, darling," Renata said. "You avenged, and that's a damn sight harder." Elspeth smiled. "Revenge has such a sharp sound to it, and justice has such a long wait," Renata quipped. "Call it what you like. You made yourself visible again." That word stuck with her. Visible. She began to use it in her talks, her essays, her interviews. "Visibility is not vanity," she wrote in one piece. "It's survival. For women, past a certain age, silence is expected. But silence is how we vanish. I will not vanish." She spoke in community centers and conference halls, in retirement homes and bookstores. At a university panel, a girl with pink hair and bitten fingernails stood up and asked, "What should I do if I think my grandmother is disappearing?" Elspeth had paused, letting the room settle. "Ask her questions," she'd said. "Then, listen. Don't try to fix her. Don't treat her like a project. Just make space for her story." The girl had cried. So had half the audience. And in her hotel room that night, Elspeth cried too. Not out of grief, but out of the sheer, overwhelming beauty of being heard. Back in Asheville, the second chapter's project was blooming. Tom, now officially her partner, a term they both liked for its practicality and lack of drama, had taken over coordinating volunteers. The garden dedicated in her name was thriving. Lavender, rosemary, hydrangeas, and an entire bed of white irises had sprung up where once there had been only sod. Elias spent his summer before college recording interviews with seniors across the state. He grew into his voice the way some people grow into their names, suddenly and perfectly. One of his audio documentaries, "The Grandmother Who Refused to Stay Dead," went viral online. He sent Elspeth the link with a single note. "You started something." And she had. But with every new city, every accolade, she thought not of revenge but of return. Not to Asheville necessarily, but to something more fundamental, to herself. One late October morning in Seattle, she received a letter from Ambrose. It was short, 3 pages, handwritten in his neat, slightly architectural print. He began not with an apology, but with a memory, being 5 years old, sitting on her lap in the library while she read The Secret Garden. He remembered the smell of her perfume, the way she pronounced melancholy. How safe her voice made him feel. Then he confessed, not just to what he'd done, but to why. You were too strong to be weak, and I couldn't understand that. I wanted to fix things for you instead of being there beside you. And when I couldn't fix you, I disappeared you instead. There's no excuse for that. I was selfish. I was cruel. I will regret it forever." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply wrote, "I know I don't deserve to be in your life again, but I am glad you lived. You are doing more now than I ever did at my best. I hope Elias learns from you what I failed to." She folded the letter and placed it in the back of her notebook. No reply. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. Some truths didn't need closing chapters. They needed distance. They needed peace. By the time spring returned, Elspeth had settled in New Orleans, a city of ghosts, music, heat, and reinvention. She found a small cottage with a creaky porch and bougainvillea that threatened to overtake the fence. She wrote in the mornings, walked by the river in the afternoons, and sometimes joined a neighbor's jazz quartet in the courtyard on Sundays. One warm evening, Tom arrived unannounced, a duffel bag in one hand and a bottle of North Carolina, wine in the other. "Thought I'd see if this porch was as fine as you claimed," he said. "It's better with company," she replied. And so it was. She never reclaimed the title of mother, not in the way society often frames it. Endless, unconditional, sacrificial. She chose instead to be Elspeth first, reader, teacher, writer, woman, a person worth knowing, not managing. And in that final act of reclamation, she offered a blueprint for others. To be heard, to be seen, to be known, even after death was announced in your name, even after your life was boxed and sold, even after the world moved on. Because sometimes resurrection isn't a miracle, it's a decision. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.